We're living at the moment at a collapse of Western, not Western, we're living at the moment of a collapse of civilized values. And when Anthony Sullivan says, quite rightly, with great respect, if you think Farage is the best we've got, then you're losing your marbles. Farage and his party are vacuous. I mean, beyond immigration, what have they got? They gave us Brexit, and look how that's turned out. Next, they want to build a wall like the orange one. If he's the best we've got, then God help us. And that is exactly the point that I'm afraid I am making. Pedrega Hooligan says, "Have some Madeira, Madeira. I've got a small cask of it here. And once it's been opened, you know it won't keep. Do finish it up. It'll help you to sleep." It's always good to have a little bit of Flanders and Swan. And Terry Hand says, "Remind us what Farage has actually done in his political career other than scare the Tories into calling a referendum. That didn't work out well. Anyone can shout from the opposition benches." And again, that is absolutely true. And that, I'm afraid, is the point that I'm making. So please don't misunderstand what I'm saying. I have no interest in promoting the cause of Mr. Farage at all. I'm simply saying he is practically the best available. And I'm talking about technique because nobody else in British politics has the technique to command the headlines day after day after day with anything other than a wringing of the hands and a cry of despair about how awful they are. Farage commands the headlines, and so incidentally does Kemi Badenoch and indeed Rachel Reeves does. But Badenoch and Reeves are not commanding the headlines because of anything that they're saying which is intentional. They're commanding the headlines because the newspapers are lamenting their incompetence, as they did in the past lament the incompetence of Liz Truss and Matt Hancock and various other individuals who have commanded the press, but never for anything positive. And then we move across to Slovakia and Robert Fico's threats to cut financial support for Ukrainian refugees in Slovakia. He's another person who commands the press, but not for anything positive, going off to Moscow to sample a bit of Putin. It's like licking an ice cream, isn't it? At least one knows that Putin is frozen. But to his new plans suggest that the ice has entered his heart. It's a little bit like the Snow Queen, the original, not the frozen Disney version, where the ice lodges in the heart of the boy, and he gradually becomes a bad boy. And Fico is definitely that. And he now says he wants to cut the financial aid for Ukrainian refugees in Slovakia and halt electricity exports to Ukraine. And this exposes a troubling misunderstanding of international obligations and a disregard for the humanitarian principles enshrined in the 1951 Refugee Convention. This rhetoric of his, rooted in Slovakia's economic grievances over lost gas transit fees, risks undermining the nation's standing within the EU and its commitment to global solidarity during a time of crisis. And the Ukrainian decision to shut down the pipeline carrying Russian gas to Central Europe, long a lifeline for Slovakia's transit economy, has undoubtedly dealt a financial blow, costing an estimated 500 million euros in transit fees. But Slovakia, as Fico himself admits, is not at risk of energy shortages, having secured alternative arrangements. And this is all about pique. And Ukraine is perfectly entitled to not to negotiate another 5-year arrangement with Russia. How would it do so anyway? How would it arrange those negotiations with a country that it is at war with, that has invaded it? The urgent necessity for punitive measures against Ukraine or its refugees who fled the war of Russia is something absurd and threatened by a European ally. Fico's framing of Kyiv's pipeline closure as sabotage is provocative and absurd in itself, particularly given his recent trip to Moscow, his apparent willingness to engage with Vladimir Putin or lick his lolly. This positioning aligns Slovakia perilously close to Russia's geopolitical agenda, and certainly close to Putin's agenda, and undermines the EU efforts to isolate Moscow economically. Threatening Ukrainian refugees with reduced financial aid weaponizes their vulnerability for political gain, and the 1951 Refugee Convention obliges states to protect refugees without discrimination, ensuring access to basic rights such as housing, healthcare, financial support. These are not conditional privileges, but essential protections. Now, we can't turn round in the UK and say, oh yes, we are champions of the 1951 Refugee Convention, because it's already been eroded by Suella Braverman and her Rwanda nonsense. It puts us entirely on the back foot when opposing the measures that Fico is now proposing. And Fico suggests that refugees bear responsibility for the actions of Ukraine's government, over which they have no influence. This flouts the core principle of non-penalisation under international refugee law. His stance risks creating a dangerous precedent in Europe, as if one hasn't already been created by Suella Braverman. With solidarity with refugees has already been tested because of the rising populism. Fico's move not only weakens the safety for over 130,000 Ukrainians, but threatens to erode regional stability and trust within the EU itself. His overtures to Moscow could be seen as a strategic shift, contrasting starkly with Poland's strong pro-Ukrainian stance, and Poland's offer to support Ukraine's energy needs demonstrates leadership, while Fico's rhetoric is reactionary, self-serving, and simply pompous and treacherous. And the European Commission's preparedness for Kyiv's pipeline shutdown shows that Slovakia's losses, while significant, were not unmanageable. Rather than retaliate against Ukraine, Fico could seek compensation through EU mechanisms or broader solidarity arrangements, and this would reinforce European unity rather than fragment it. Fico's threats reflect not only a failure of compassion, but also a short-sighted approach to Slovakia's global interests. By alienating Ukraine and leaning towards Russia, he risks isolating Slovakia within the EU while undermining its moral and legal commitments to refugee protection. His actions demand a unified European response to affirm the importance of the Refugee Convention, not only a unified European response, but a global response, and to hold Slovakia accountable for its responsibilities as a civilized member of the EU, of NATO, of the global civilized population. And meanwhile, we need to think about what we can do to help Moldova, as it's also impacted by this pipeline closure. But Fico is pulling all the attention to him. It's a self-serving, noisy, noisy standoff and display. It's shocking.